The child by the window. The hospital corridors were quiet, but not silent. They carried the soft rhythm of machines breathing for the weak, the distant echo of hurried footsteps, the low murmurs of families waiting for news that could change their lives in a single sentence. Fluorescent lights washed the walls in pale color, making every face look tired, every shadow heavier. In one corner of the pediatric ward, near a tall, narrow window, a small boy sat alone in a wheelchair, his feet not quite touching the floor. His body was thin, almost fragile, wrapped in a faded hoodie far too big for him, and in his hands he held a small toy car with chipped red paint and one crooked wheel. He rolled it back and forth across his knees slowly, carefully, as if the tiny motion was the only thing keeping his world from falling apart. Outside the glass, the city moved on. Cars passed. People laughed. Life continued. Inside, the boy watched it all like someone staring at a world he wasn't sure he still belonged to. Sandra Bullock had come to the hospital quietly, without press or announcements. A local children's charity had invited her to spend time with patients, nothing formal, nothing staged. Just a few hours of smiles, small gifts, and conversations meant to lift spirits. She had done visits like this before, but something about this place felt heavier the moment she stepped inside. The air itself seemed tired. She had already spoken to several children, signed a few books, laughed softly with parents who tried hard not to cry in front of their kids. Then she saw him, the boy by the window, not calling for anyone, not playing loudly, just sitting there, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes fixed on the outside world. Something in his stillness pulled her toward him more strongly than any excited voice ever could. She walked slowly, her steps careful, as if the sound of her shoes might break whatever fragile peace surrounded him. When she knelt beside him, he didn't look up right away. His fingers continued tracing the scratches on the toy car over and over like he was memorizing them. Sandra spoke gently, her voice low and warm. "Hey there, what's your name?" The boy hesitated, then finally lifted his eyes. They were too tired for someone so young, but there was still a spark buried deep inside them. "Daniel," he whispered. Sandra smiled, though her chest tightened. "That's a strong name," she said. "It sounds like someone who doesn't give up easily." Daniel didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth twitched, just barely, like he wanted to believe her. As she sat beside him, a nurse passed by speaking quietly to another staff member. They didn't realize Sandra could hear them. "His condition is getting worse," the nurse murmured, "and the father's struggling. He can barely keep up with the treatment costs." The words sank into Sandra slowly, painfully. She had witnessed sadness before. She had visited hospitals before, but this felt different. This felt like standing on the edge of something fragile, something that could disappear if the wrong word was spoken. She glanced back at Daniel, at the way he clutched the little car as if it were the last solid thing he owned in a world that kept slipping away. "You like cars?" Sandra asked softly, pointing to the toy. Daniel nodded. "My dad fixes them," he said. "At a garage, he used to bring broken ones home and let me hold the tools." His voice grew quieter. "He can't come much now, he has to work." Sandra felt the weight behind that simple sentence. A father choosing between earning money for treatment and sitting beside his child's bed. A family living inside an impossible choice. She swallowed and stayed with him, asking small questions, listening to every word as if it mattered more than anything else she had planned that day. Because right now, it did. At the far end of the hallway, a tall figure appeared, moving without hurry, almost blending into the rhythm of the hospital itself. He wore dark clothes, no entourage, no cameras, no attention-seeking presence. He stopped briefly to thank a nurse, nodded respectfully to a doctor, then continued forward. Keanu Reeves had come on his own after hearing through a friend that the pediatric ward was struggling. He hadn't announced it. He hadn't told anyone to prepare. He simply showed up, carrying a small bag and the quiet intention to be useful in whatever way he could. When he noticed Sandra sitting beside the boy, he slowed, observing first, not wanting to interrupt. Daniel, however, saw him before Sandra did. His eyes widened slightly, curiosity breaking through the exhaustion. Keanu approached and crouched so he was level with the wheelchair. His voice was gentle, almost playful, but filled with a calm strength that softened the space around him. "Hey there," he said. "I heard there's a real car expert down this hallway. Thought I should introduce myself." Daniel blinked. I'm not an expert," Keanu smiled. "Anyone who holds onto a car like that must know something important about them." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook, opening it to reveal quick sketches. Motorcycles, old-style cars, a half-finished drawing of a vehicle that looked like it belonged in a dream. "I draw when I travel," Keanu said. "Not very well, but it helps me think." Daniel leaned forward slightly, studying the pages. "That one," he whispered, pointing. "It looks fast." Keanu nodded. "It does, but it's missing something." Daniel frowned in concentration. Wings, he said after a moment, so it can fly when the road ends. Sandra watched from the side, her throat tight. There was no performance in what she was seeing, no celebrity energy, just a man kneeling on a hospital floor inviting a sick child into a moment of imagination. Keanu handed Daniel a pen. "Then maybe you can help me," he said. Daniel hesitated, then carefully added 2 small wings to the sides of the car. His hand trembled, but he smiled. It wasn't big, it wasn't loud, but it was real. And in that instant, the machines, the whispers, the fear all seemed to step back, just enough to let something else exist in the room. Sandra felt something shift inside her. She had come to lift spirits, to offer comfort. But this felt like the beginning of something she didn't yet have words for. She saw the way Keanu listened, the way Daniel's shoulders relaxed, the way a fragile moment of dignity bloomed in a place filled with helplessness, and quietly, without anyone announcing it, a question formed in her heart. What happens when this visit ends? When the smiles fade? When the long nights return? Down the hallway, thunder rolled outside, distant but growing. And as rain began tapping against the hospital windows, none of them yet knew that this small meeting, this simple drawing, this shared silence, was the first step into a storm that would soon test their kindness, their strength, and everything they believed about what one human being could do for another. When the night refused to let go, the night settled over the hospital like a heavy blanket, muting the outside world but sharpening everything inside. The corridors glowed under artificial light, and every sound seemed louder in the quiet. Wheels of carts rolling slowly, distant intercom calls, the steady electronic breathing of machines that never slept. Daniel's room was dim, illuminated only by a small lamp near his bed and the blinking monitors beside him. His small chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath a fragile negotiation with the air. Sandra sat beside him, her coat folded across her lap, her fingers lightly wrapped around his hand as though she could anchor him to the world by touch alone. Keanu stood near the window, his reflection faint in the glass, watching the rain slide down in thin silver lines. Outside, the storm gathered strength, wind pressing against the building, as if the night itself were testing the walls that protected the children inside. Daniel stirred, his eyelids fluttering. "Are you still here?" he whispered, his voice barely stronger than the hum of the machines. Sandra leaned closer. "We're both here," she said softly. "We didn't go anywhere." He nodded faintly, as if reassured by the simple fact of their presence. For a while, none of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of things no one wanted to say out loud, the fear that tomorrow might be worse, the hope that maybe somehow it wouldn't be. Somewhere down the hall, a child cried out in pain, and a nurse hurried past Daniel's door. Sandra felt every sound in her chest. She had walked red carpets, stood before thousands, navigated storms of opinion and expectation. None of that had prepared her for this quiet war being fought in narrow rooms by people who never asked to be soldiers. When Daniel finally drifted into a shallow sleep, Sandra slipped her hand away slowly and stood, careful not to wake him. She joined Keanu by the window, the city lights blurred behind the rain, distant and unreal. "I can't stop thinking about what the nurse said," she murmured. "About his family, about the costs." Keanu didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed on the glass. "I've seen this before," he said quietly. Good people losing time with the ones they love because the fight becomes about survival instead of living. It changes everything. Sandra closed her eyes. "It already has." Her phone vibrated in her hand, the soft buzz loud in the silence. A message from the same nurse. "His father's outside. He's not doing well." Sandra's heart tightened. They stepped into the hallway together. Daniel's father sat on a plastic chair near the nurse's station, his elbows on his knees, his hands pressed against his face. He didn't look up when they approached. His shoulders trembled, though he made no sound. Sandra knelt in front of him, her voice gentle. "You don't have to carry this alone." He shook his head, his words breaking through his hands. "I'm failing him. Every day I choose work over sitting beside his bed, and every night I come back afraid I chose wrong." Keanu lowered himself beside him, not above him, not apart from him, but with him. "You chose love," he said. "You're trying to keep him alive. That's not failure." The man finally looked up. His eyes were red, exhausted, filled with a kind of fear that had no place to rest. "The doctors are talking about new tests, new treatment. I don't even ask how much anymore. I just nod." His voice cracked. "I don't know how long I can keep pretending I'm strong." They sat there together, 3 adults in a hallway full of strangers, bound by one small boy sleeping behind a door. Sandra felt something firm settle inside her, a line she could not cross back over. "We're not pretending," she said. "We're doing, and we're going to keep doing." The father looked at her, confusion and fragile hope fighting in his eyes. "I don't even know what that means anymore." Keanu answered, his voice calm but unmovable. It means we stay, and we find a way forward together. They returned to Daniel's room just as a nurse entered to check his vitals. The woman's face was professional, but her eyes lingered on the monitor longer than necessary. When she left, she paused in the doorway. "He had a difficult evening," she said quietly. "We're seeing changes. The doctor will want to speak with you in the morning." Sandra felt the words settle like weight in her stomach. After the door closed, Keanu walked back to Daniel's bed. He took the notebook from his jacket again, flipping to the page with the car and wings. Slowly, carefully, he added lines, strengthening the wings, shaping them. When he finished, he placed the notebook where Daniel would see it when he woke. "You were right," he murmured, almost to himself. "Every car should have a way to fly when the road disappears." The storm outside deepened through the night. Rain drummed against the windows. Thunder rolled closer, louder. Somewhere near dawn, Daniel's breathing changed. The monitors shifted their rhythm, a sharper tone slipping into the steady beeping. Sandra was on her feet before the nurse even called out. Doctors entered quickly, voices low but urgent, hands adjusting machines, checking readings, shining light into Daniel's eyes. His father stood frozen in the corner, his face pale, as if the world were narrowing to a single unbearable point. Keanu moved to him, placing both hands on his shoulders, grounding him. "Breathe," he said firmly. "Stay with him." Daniel's eyes opened, unfocused, searching. "Dad," he whispered. His father rushed forward, taking his hand. "I'm here, buddy, I'm right here." Daniel's gaze drifted towards Sandra and Keanu. "You didn't leave," he said faintly. Sandra's voice trembled. "We told you we wouldn't." After long minutes that stretched like hours, the machines settled again. The doctors stepped back. One of them spoke quietly but clearly. "This is becoming more frequent. We need to prepare for the next stage of treatment. Without it, his body won't be able to keep up." The father's knees buckled, and he sank into the chair behind him. Sandra felt cold spread through her chest. "How soon?" she asked. The doctor hesitated. "Soon, days, not weeks." When they were alone again, the room felt smaller, the walls closer, the ceiling heavier. Daniel had fallen back into exhausted sleep, his small fingers still wrapped around his father's. Sandra stepped back, unable to look away. "We can't let this turn into waiting," she whispered. Keanu nodded. "Waiting is where hope goes to fade." He looked at Daniel, then at his father, then back at Sandra. "We need to move tonight. Tomorrow may already be too late." Sandra swallowed. "Then we start now." They left the room together, but they did not leave the hospital. They walked its length instead, past waiting rooms where parents lay curled on chairs, past vending machines glowing like false comfort, past doors that held stories no one wanted. Sandra stopped beside a woman rocking a baby wrapped in a thin blanket. She asked how long she had been there. 3 days, the woman answered. "They say there's no bed yet." Sandra sat with her. Keanu spoke with a grandfather who had not slept in 48 hours. They listened. They brought water. They shared quiet words. They gave their time, the one thing no hospital could manufacture. By the time the first pale hint of morning touched the windows, exhaustion weighed on them, but so did something else. A sense that what had begun with a drawing was becoming something neither of them could step away from. Sandra leaned against the wall near Daniel's door, her voice barely more than a breath. "This is only the beginning, isn't it?" Keanu looked down the corridor filled with half-awake families and glowing machines. "Yes," he said, "and beginnings are always the heaviest part." Behind the door, Daniel slept, unaware that his fragile fight had already begun to pull two strangers into a journey far larger than a hospital room. Outside, the storm slowly weakened, leaving wet streets and low clouds behind. Inside, the storm had only just begun. The decision that could not wait. Morning did not bring relief. It only made everything clearer. Sunlight crept through the high hospital windows, touching the pale walls and the tired faces of families who had not slept. The night's storm had washed the city clean, but inside the pediatric ward, the air still felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. Daniel lay quietly in his bed, his skin almost translucent under the soft sheets, his small chest rising and falling with an effort that no child should ever have to make. The machines beside him glowed steadily, but their calm rhythm felt deceptive, like the silence before something breaks. Sandra sat near his bed, watching every movement, every flutter of his eyelids, as if her attention alone could protect him. Keanu stood a few steps back, speaking quietly with a doctor whose expression carried both compassion and warning. The doctor's words were careful, chosen the way people choose words when they know the truth hurts. Daniel's body was no longer responding to standard treatment. The next step required advanced procedures, specialized equipment, and a team that the hospital could not fully provide on its own. It was possible, the doctor explained, but it would take immediate coordination, outside specialists, and significant resources. Time was no longer measured in weeks or even days, but in fragile windows that could close without notice. Sandra felt each sentence land inside her like a weight. She looked at Daniel's father, who stood silently near the wall, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands clenched as if he were physically holding himself together. "What happens if we can't move fast enough?" Sandra asked. The doctor did not avoid her eyes. "Then we prepare for comfort instead of recovery." The words echoed through the room like a sentence no one was ready to hear. When the doctor left, the room felt unbearably still. Daniel slept, unaware of the conversation shaping his future. His father slowly slid down into the chair beside the bed, his face in his hands. "I knew this day was coming," he said quietly. "They always say we'll see until there's nothing left to see." Sandra felt tears burn in her eyes, but she held them back, moving closer to him. "This day doesn't get to decide everything," she said. He let out a broken breath. "You don't understand. I've already sold my truck. I've borrowed from everyone I know. I work nights and mornings. I still come up short. I can't chase miracles anymore." Keanu stepped forward then, his voice calm but filled with something deeper, something forged by loss. "Then don't chase them alone. Let us carry part of this." The father looked up sharply. "You've already done more than anyone should ask." Keanu shook his head slowly. "No, we've only done what was easy. Being present is easy. Sitting and listening is easy. The hard part is deciding not to walk away when it becomes complicated." He looked at Daniel, then back at the man. "This is complicated. That's exactly why we stay." Sandra felt something solidify inside her. The fear was still there, but it no longer owned her. "We're not here as visitors anymore," she said. "We're here because Daniel's life matters, and because your life matters, and because sometimes the world doesn't change unless someone refuses to accept what's handed to them." They stepped into the hallway together. The ward had begun to stir. Parents whispered over coffee. Nurses moved with practiced urgency. Somewhere a child laughed weakly at something a volunteer had said. Life continued in fragments, beautiful and unbearable at the same time. Sandra leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. "We need specialists, equipment. We need to move him if we have to." Keanu nodded. "I've already made a call. A friend of mine works with an international pediatric team. They can review his case today." Sandra opened her eyes. "Today?" He met her gaze. "Today, because tomorrow might already be too late." While Daniel slept, they worked. Quietly, urgently, without spectacle. Keanu spoke with doctors, sharing files, arranging video calls, asking questions not as a celebrity, but as someone who needed to understand every possibility. Sandra met with the hospital's social services coordinator, learning about funding gaps, equipment shortages, families who had walked away because hope had simply become too expensive. With every conversation, the picture grew heavier. Daniel's case was not rare. He was one of many, and the realization cut deeper than anything else. Even if they saved him, what about the others? By midday, the specialists called back. They believed Daniel could qualify for an advanced treatment protocol, but it would require immediate action, rapid transport, and a medical support plan that went beyond what the hospital could currently provide. It was not guaranteed. It was not safe. It was not simple, but it was possible. When Keanu relayed the information, Daniel's father stared at him as if he were describing another world. "You mean there's still a chance?" Keanu nodded. "A real one?" The man's hands began to shake. "And the cost," Sandra answered before Keanu could, "we'll handle it." He shook his head instinctively. "I can't accept that." Sandra's voice softened. "This isn't charity, this is humanity. One day someone helped me when I didn't know how to help myself. Let me pass that forward." They returned to Daniel's room as he slowly woke. His eyes moved first to his father, then to Sandra, then to Keanu. "Did I miss something?" he whispered. Keanu smiled gently and pulled the notebook from his pocket. He flipped to a new page. On it was a car, bigger now, stronger, its wings wider and detailed. Beneath it, he had written a single word, tomorrow. "We're building something new," Keanu said. "Something that helps you go further than yesterday." Daniel studied the drawing, then looked up. Am I still going to be here tomorrow?" Sandra knelt beside the bed. Her voice was steady, but her heart was not. "We're doing everything we can to make sure you are." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then he nodded once. "Okay," he said, "then I'm not scared." His father's breath caught as he took his son's hand. "You don't have to be brave," he whispered. Daniel squeezed his fingers weakly. "I know, but I want to be." Late that afternoon, Daniel's condition shifted again. His breathing grew labored. The machines changed their tone. Nurses entered quickly, doctors followed. The fragile calm shattered into focused movement. Sandra felt the familiar surge of helplessness, but this time it carried something else with it, determination. Keanu stood with Daniel's father anchoring him while doctors worked. After long minutes, the room steadied, but the message was clear. Time was no longer a concept. It was a threat. When the doctors finally stepped back, one of them spoke plainly. "If we're going to move forward, it has to be now." Sandra felt the room narrow to a single point. She looked at Keanu. He didn't hesitate. "Then we start now." As preparations began, paperwork moving faster than anyone thought possible, equipment being arranged, calls being made, the hospital seemed to hold its breath. Outside, cars passed, people lived their ordinary days, unaware that in one small room, a child's future hung on decisions being made minute by minute. Sandra stood by the window once more, watching the light shift across the buildings. She realized that nothing about her life would ever feel ordinary again. Because once you stand this close to losing someone, you don't get to go back to who you were before. Behind her, Daniel slept, unaware that a battle far larger than his small body was unfolding around him. And somewhere between whispered conversations and urgent footsteps, between hope and fear, a line had been crossed. This was no longer a visit. This was a fight, and none of them were stepping away. When hope was put on a clock, the hospital no longer felt like a place of waiting. It felt like a place of movement, of quiet urgency, of decisions being made that could not be undone. The air carried the faint scent of disinfectant mixed with something harder to name, the tension of people who knew every minute mattered. Equipment carts rolled more frequently down the corridors. Nurses spoke in lower voices, but with sharper focus. Somewhere beyond the walls, traffic flowed, coffee shops opened. Ordinary life continued without realizing that in one narrow wing of this building, time itself had become the enemy. Daniel lay surrounded by soft light and steady machines, his small body preparing for something far bigger than he could fully understand. Sandra sat near him, her fingers lightly brushing his hair as he drifted in and out of sleep. Keanu stood near the foot of the bed, speaking quietly with a new team of doctors who had arrived only an hour earlier, their coats still creased from travel, their faces already marked by concern. The lead specialist explained the plan carefully, outlining steps, risks, windows of possibility. The treatment was aggressive. It would push Daniel's fragile body to its limits. It offered no guarantees, only a chance, but chance was something they no longer took lightly. Daniel's father listened as if every word were being carved into him. When the doctor finished, he asked one question, his voice almost steady. "Will he suffer?" The doctor met his eyes. "We will do everything to protect him." "But this will not be easy." The father nodded slowly, the kind of nod a person gives when they understand that love is not about comfort, but about standing in pain without turning away. When Daniel woke again, the room had changed. More machines, more people, more quiet urgency. He looked around slowly, then whispered, "Is something wrong?" Sandra leaned close, keeping her voice calm. "Something important is happening. The doctors are going to help your body fight harder." Daniel frowned slightly. "Is it going to hurt?" Keanu stepped closer. "Some parts might feel uncomfortable," he said gently, "but you won't be alone, not for 1 second." Daniel studied his face, then nodded. "Okay, then I can do it." His father took his hand, pressing it gently against his own cheek as if memorizing its warmth. "You don't have to be strong for us," he said. "We're strong for you." Daniel gave a small smile. "I know." As preparations continued, something else began to move through the hospital. Whispers, curious glances. A nurse mentioned quietly that people outside were asking questions. Someone had seen Sandra and Keanu staying late. Someone had shared a photo. Nothing dramatic, just fragments, but fragments were enough to start a story. The hospital director approached Keanu in the hallway, concern in her eyes. "There are reporters near the entrance. They're asking if you're involved in a case here." Keanu closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "This isn't about us," he said. "This is about a child who needs care." She nodded. "I understand, but attention follows you whether you want it or not." Sandra felt a familiar knot form in her chest, one she had known for years, but never here, never like this. "The last thing Daniel needs is cameras," she said quietly. "He needs peace." Keanu met her gaze. "Then we protect that peace as much as we can." They made a simple decision. No statements, no interviews, no confirmation. They returned to Daniel's room and closed the door. Hours passed. Doctors moved in and out. IV lines were adjusted. Machines hummed. Daniel grew quieter, conserving what little strength he had. Sandra remained beside him, telling him soft stories about road trips and open skies, about places where children ran without wires and windows. Keanu sat across the room, sketching again, but his lines were slower now, heavier, as if each stroke carried something he could not speak. Daniel watched him for a while. "Are you drawing my car?" he asked faintly. Keanu nodded. "I'm making it stronger." Daniel's eyes half closed. "Make it really strong," he whispered, "so it can carry my dad, too." Keanu's hand stilled for a moment before continuing. Late in the afternoon, the doctors said it was time to begin. The words fell with quiet finality. Daniel's father kissed his son's forehead, his hands shaking now. "I'm right outside," he promised. Daniel nodded. "Don't go far." Sandra leaned down, pressing her forehead gently against his. "We'll be here when you open your eyes." Keanu placed the notebook on the bedside table, open to the drawing of the flying car. "This is waiting for you," he said, "so you can tell me what to fix." They wheeled Daniel out of the room, his small bed moving down the corridor like a fragile ship into heavy water. Sandra and Keanu walked beside his father until the doors to the treatment wing closed. Then there was nothing left to do but wait. The hallway outside was too bright, too ordinary for what it held. Sandra sat beside the father. Keanu stood nearby, his hands folded, his eyes closed. Time lost its shape. Minutes stretched. Voices passed. Phones vibrated. Somewhere far away, laughter echoed from another floor, jarring and unreal. It was during that long waiting that the first call came. The hospital director returned, her expression tight. "There are news vans now," she said. "They're asking about donations, about involvement." Sandra's jaw tightened. "This cannot become a spectacle." Keanu's voice was calm but unyielding. "It won't. We won't let it." But he knew, even as he said it, that once attention began, it rarely listened. Sandra rose and walked to the end of the corridor, leaning her forehead against the cool glass of a window. She watched clouds drifting slowly across the sky, indifferent to what was happening below. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. Keanu joined her. "So am I," she looked at him. "Not just of losing him, of what happens after, if he makes it, if he doesn't. This changes you, you don't get to unsee this." Keanu nodded. "You're right, you don't." He paused. "But maybe that's the point." Hours later, a door finally opened. A doctor stepped out, his face unreadable. The father was on his feet instantly. Sandra felt her heart pound so hard she could hear it. Keanu moved closer. The doctor took a breath. "The procedure is ongoing. He's responding, but it's early. We're not out of danger." The words brought neither victory nor defeat. Only more waiting, more uncertainty. As night approached again, the hospital lights grew harsher, the corridors emptier. Outside, cameras waited. Inside, 3 adults sat bound by a child fighting for his next breath. Sandra closed her eyes, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She realized that hope, real hope, was not soft. It was not comforting. It was sharp. It demanded endurance. It demanded that you stay even when leaving would hurt less. Somewhere beyond the closed doors, Daniel's small body was being asked to do something extraordinary. And whether the world ever knew or not, whether headlines came or faded, this moment would mark them forever. Because hope was no longer an idea. It was on a clock, and the clock was ticking. When the world finally looked in, the second night of waiting settled over the hospital like a held breath that refused to release. The corridor outside the treatment wing had thinned to a quiet stretch of pale walls, polished floors, and the faint hum of distant machines. Sandra sat with her arms wrapped around herself, the chair beneath her cold and unforgiving. She could not remember the last time she had truly slept. Every time her eyes closed, she saw Daniel's small hand gripping the toy car, his voice asking if he would wake up. Across from her, Daniel's father stared at the floor as if it might open and swallow his fear. Keanu stood nearby, unmoving, his presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but gave it anyway. The clock on the wall clicked forward with slow cruelty, each second loud in the silence. Beyond the hospital entrance, a different world was gathering. News vans had parked along the curb. Reporters murmured into phones. A few curious onlookers stood behind barriers, whispering names, scrolling feeds, searching for meaning in fragments of rumor. Someone had shared that Keanu Reeves had been at the hospital. Someone else had claimed Sandra Bullock was funding treatments. No one had the full truth, but partial stories were already moving faster than the fragile fight unfolding behind closed doors. The hospital director approached them again, quieter this time, her voice carrying concern. "They're asking if we can confirm anything," she said. "They're promising respectful coverage." Sandra felt a familiar weight press on her chest. "This isn't content," she said. "This is a child." Keanu nodded. "We won't turn him into a headline." The director hesitated. "If you don't speak, others will, and they may not be kind." Keanu considered this, then replied calmly, "Then they won't be speaking for us." Inside the treatment wing, doctors moved with controlled urgency. Machines whispered and clicked. Lines carried medicine, oxygen, hope. Daniel's body fought quietly, unaware of the attention building outside, unaware of the fear folding and unfolding just beyond the walls. His father pressed his palms together as if holding something invisible. "I keep thinking about when he was born," he murmured suddenly. He was so small I was afraid to touch him. I thought I might break him. And now. His voice failed. Sandra reached for his arm, grounding him. He's still fighting, she said. That matters, the man swallowed. He's always been a fighter. Even when he learned to walk, he kept falling, but he would look up at me like he was offended the floor existed. Keanu listened, his gaze soft. Sometimes the strongest people come in the smallest bodies, he said. Hours later, the door finally opened again. This time, the doctor's face held something new. Not relief, not victory, but cautious light. The treatment is beginning to take effect, he said. His vitals are stabilizing. He's not out of danger, but this is the first positive shift we've seen. The father let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, collapsing back into his chair. Sandra closed her eyes, tears spilling freely now, not in control anymore, not caring who saw. Keanu placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Thank you, the father whispered hoarsely. Whatever happens, thank you, Keanu shook his head gently. This isn't the end of the road, it's the first turn. They were allowed into the room shortly after. Daniel lay pale but calmer, the harsh tension eased slightly from his small body. The machines still surrounded him, but their rhythm was less urgent. Sandra approached slowly, afraid to hope too loudly. When Daniel's eyes fluttered open, she felt something inside her break and rebuild at the same time. Hey, she whispered. Daniel looked at her, then at his father, then at Keanu. His lips curved faintly. Did it work? Keanu leaned closer. Your body did something brave today. Daniel's gaze drifted to the bedside table where the notebook lay. Did my car wait? Keanu smiled and opened it. The wings were bigger now, the lines darker, the shape stronger. It waited, he said, and it's ready for the next part. Daniel closed his eyes again, a faint peace settling over his face. His father took his hand, pressing his forehead gently against it. You came back, he whispered. As night deepened, something else began to happen in the hospital. Families who had been watching quietly now approached with soft gratitude. A mother thanked Sandra for sitting with her daughter earlier. A grandfather nodded to Keanu, his eyes full, his voice unable to form words. Nurses whispered appreciation not for money, but for the way they had stayed, the way they had listened. And beyond the glass doors, the world was no longer just curious. People were sharing. Messages were spreading. Not about fame, but about a child fighting, about strangers choosing to stand with him. Donations began arriving at the hospital in small, unexpected waves. A few dollars, a few hundred, a message from a retired teacher, a note from a teenager who said she had once been that child in the bed. The hospital director returned, stunned. We've received more inquiries and small contributions in the last 2 hours than we usually see in months, she said quietly. People aren't asking about you. They're asking how to help the children. Sandra felt her breath catch. She looked down the corridor where parents still waited, where children still fought unseen battles. This can't end with Daniel, she said. Keanu nodded slowly. It won't. He turned to the director. Set up a fund, quietly. For emergency pediatric care. No names on the door, no spotlight, just access. The director hesitated. That kind of program, Keanu met her eyes, is exactly what this place needs. Later, as Daniel slept more peacefully than he had in days, Sandra stepped into the small hospital chapel, drawn there without quite knowing why. The space was dim, lit by a few candles, the air still. She sat, hands clasped, not praying in words but in feelings, fear, gratitude, resolve. Keanu joined her after a while, sitting beside her without speaking. After a long silence, she said, even if he survives this, his road is still long. Keanu nodded. So is ours. She turned to him. I don't want this to be something we tell people about someday. I want it to be something we keep doing. He looked at her, understanding clear in his eyes. Then it will be. Outside, the cameras continued to wait, but inside, something far more important was forming. A shift, a quiet movement, the realization that kindness, once seen, rarely stays contained. Daniel's fragile victory had cracked open a door, and through it the world was beginning, slowly, imperfectly, to look in. The wings that remained. The hospital did not feel the same after that night. The lights were still harsh. The machines still hummed. The corridors still echoed with the quiet urgency of medicine and worry. But something invisible had shifted. It lived in the way nurses lingered a little longer in doorways, in the way parents spoke more gently to one another, in the way small moments of laughter dared to exist beside fear. Daniel lay in his bed beneath a pale blue blanket, his breathing steadier now, his face no longer drawn as tightly against pain. The battle inside his body was far from over, but it had changed shape. It was no longer only about survival. It was about rebuilding, about teaching fragile strength how to stand again. Sandra sat near the window, sunlight brushing her face as she watched Daniel sleep. His toy car rested on the table beside him, and next to it lay Keanu's sketchbook, open to the drawing that had become something of a quiet symbol. The little car no longer just had wings. It had motion. It had sky. It had a horizon sketched faintly beyond it, as if it were always heading somewhere new. Sandra had not meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had finally taken her. When she woke, Daniel was sitting up for the first time without help, his father close beside him, his hand steady on his son's back. "He asked for water," the father whispered. Sandra's breath caught. That simple request felt like a miracle. Keanu entered a moment later, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a folded newspaper he hadn't read. When he saw Daniel sitting up, something softened in his face that Sandra had never seen before. He approached slowly, as if afraid the moment might vanish if he moved too quickly. "Look at you," he said quietly. "You're changing the rules." Daniel smiled faintly. "The doctor said my body is learning again." Keanu nodded. "That's the best kind of learning there is." Daniel reached for the sketchbook. "Did my car fly while I was sleeping?" Keanu turned the book so he could see. "It didn't just fly," he said. "It found a road in the sky." Daniel studied the drawing for a long moment, then whispered, "I think I want to be a mechanic who fixes flying cars." Sandra laughed softly through sudden tears. "I think the world could use one." In the days that followed, Daniel's progress was slow but real. Each morning brought small victories that felt impossibly large, sitting without support, laughing without coughing, taking a few careful steps between his bed and the window with his father's hands holding him steady. The doctors spoke cautiously but honestly. The treatment had given him a fighting chance. His body was responding. His future was no longer a closed door, and while no one dared to declare him healed, everyone could see it. Hope had returned to his face. It lived in his eyes now, bright where they had once been dulled by pain. Outside the hospital, the world had not grown quieter, but it had grown different. The early whispers had turned into stories, and the stories had turned into a movement of people asking how to help, not who to watch. The fund the hospital director had quietly opened began receiving steady support. Not massive, blinding numbers, but something far more powerful. Consistency. Letters arrived from parents who had once been patients there. Small envelopes from people who said they had nothing except the memory of someone they had lost and the wish to spare another family that pain. Equipment was ordered. A second specialist team was scheduled. Treatment access expanded. And no child in that wing was turned away because of money again. Sandra and Keanu did not stand before microphones. They did not announce campaigns. They simply stayed. They met with administrators. They listened to doctors. They spoke with families. They built something piece by piece the same way Daniel had built his small model car, carefully, quietly, with attention. When the hospital director finally showed them the proposal she had been working on, Sandra read it slowly, her hand covering her mouth. "You're calling it Wings for Tomorrow," she said. The director nodded. "Because one child reminded us what hope looks like." Sandra closed her eyes. Keanu lowered his head. Neither of them had suggested the name, but both of them knew exactly where it had come from. The day Daniel was moved out of intensive care, the corridor filled with a kind of joy that did not need to be loud. Nurses smiled openly. Doctors paused to watch him walk slowly beside his father. Sandra stood near the wall, her hands clasped, her heart full in a way she had never known before. Keanu knelt when Daniel reached him, their eyes level again. "You did this," he said. Daniel shook his head. "We did." He glanced at Sandra, then at his father. "All of us." Keanu felt something deep and quiet break open inside his chest. "You're right," he said. "We did." That afternoon, Daniel asked to go outside. The doctors agreed to a brief visit to the small hospital courtyard. When they wheeled him through the glass doors, sunlight washed over his face, warm and real. He closed his eyes and tilted his head back, breathing it in like something sacred. Sandra stood beside him. "What does it feel like?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "Like my car finally touched the sky." His father turned away, unable to hide his tears. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "He's teaching all of us how to breathe again." Later, as they stood watching children play in the courtyard, Sandra spoke quietly. "I used to think kindness was something you fit into life," she said. "Now I think it's something you build life around." Keanu nodded. "Because once you see how much it matters, everything else feels smaller." Sandra looked at Daniel, laughing weakly as another child pushed his wheelchair. "I don't want to forget this feeling," she said. Keanu's voice was steady. "We won't. We'll protect it by what we keep choosing to do." When the time came for Sandra to leave that evening, Daniel held out his hand. In it was the toy car, the chipped paint, the crooked wheel. "You keep it," he said. Sandra shook her head. "That's yours." Daniel pressed it into her palm. "So you remember." She closed her fingers around it, emotion flooding her chest. "I promise," she whispered. "I always will." As the sun lowered behind the buildings, painting the hospital walls in gold, Keanu stood at the window one last time, watching Daniel talk animatedly to his father, pointing toward the sky as if explaining something only he could see. The sketchbook lay open on the table behind him. The flying car, the wide wings, the open horizon. He realized then that not every story of hope ends with certainty. Some end with something more enduring: direction. Daniel's road would not be easy. The foundation would not fix everything. Suffering would not vanish from the world because 3 people had refused to look away. But something real had been built here. A place where children could fight without being alone. A place where families could breathe without counting coins. A reminder that kindness, when acted on, does not fade when the moment ends. It multiplies. And long after the cameras left, long after the rumors quieted, long after new stories replaced this one, a little boy would still sit by a window, holding a car with wings, knowing that once, when the road disappeared, strangers had helped him find the sky.